5. The Nosy Professor. As they made their way towards the cafe, Maylie asked in bewilderment, making them all laugh loudly and earn another glare from the attendant, "If your mummy becomes a mummy, what does your daddy become?" They were still explaining to Maylie how the Egyptians mummified their dead so that they would have their bodies to use in the afterlife when they reached the cafe. They were half expecting to find an angry, impatiently waiting aunt, but she had not arrived. "Whew, that's a relief," Jane said. "I was really looking forward to a milkshake. Quick, let's order before she gets here." The children all ordered chocolate milkshakes without hesitation. No other flavour came close in their opinion. They sat on their uncomfortable wire chairs, their elbows resting on the sticky red check tablecloth, and sipped their delectable drinks. "Yum," Maylie said, taking a big slurp and filling her cheeks to capacity, letting the delicious liquid trickle down her throat. She looked around, and her gaze rested on the only other occupant of the restaurant seated at the table behind him. It was an elderly man. He was bald, with the biggest, wildest beard Maylie had ever seen. She stared at him thoughtfully as she sipped. It looked, she thought, like all the hairs on the top of his head had decided to move to a new home on his chin. His skin was wrinkled and brown, as if he had spent a lifetime in the sun. He was reading a book and eating a toasted sandwich, and ignored them. "It just seems too much of a coincidence that Horus is holding a stone that looks like ours and that there's also a hieroglyphic like it on Tim and Hut's sarcophagus," Sam said. He was sure it was their stone depicted by the hieroglyph, but he could see the others weren't convinced. Peter said, adding, "But what would someone called Tim and Hut have to do with our magic stone? And he can't have been very important if his sarcophagus ended up in a small country museum right at the other end of Africa." "True," Jane said. "I've never heard of a pharaoh or king called Tim and Hut." "Tim and who?" said Sam jokingly, and they all laughed. "Actually," said the bearded man loudly from behind them, making them jump, "he was a very powerful king and renowned throughout both Upper and Lower Egypt for his great healing powers." They all turned to look at him in surprise, and Sam noticed that the book he was reading was entitled Amulets of Egypt. He smiled at the children and gestured to himself. "Professor Gamal at your service." The children smiled politely, and Jane waved her hand at them one by one as she introduced them. "I'm Jane, and this is Peter, and this is Maylie and Sam." "Very pleased to meet you," the professor said, bowing his head politely, then continued, "Yes, so as I said, King Timonhut's fame was so great that it survived for over 1,600 years. The time of the great Egyptian kings is divided into 3 periods: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom, which was the last great period of rule by the Egyptian kings. In between those times are the intermediate periods, which fall between the kingdoms, when Egypt was invaded or fragmented by internal problems. You may note I say kings, not pharaohs. The Egyptian kings were only called pharaohs during the New Kingdom. Pharaoh means great house and refers to the magnificent palaces the Egyptian kings and queens built during the New Kingdom period." There was a silence as the children digested Professor Gamal's words. "How on earth did Timonhut's sarcophagus end up here?" Peter asked wonderingly. The old man looked pleased to be asked the question. "Well, as far as I can make out, King Timonhut's tomb was found and raided by tomb robbers hundreds of years ago. His burial monument, tomb, must have got recovered by sand or destroyed, and its whereabouts is unknown today, although I've dedicated much of my life to finding it." He sighed and looked sad, and then, remembering he was in mid-story, continued, "During my investigations, I discovered that some of the contents from the tomb had been found in the desert and kept together and had ended up in the private collection of a rich Egyptian trader. I contacted his descendants. He was long dead, and asked to see them, but it transpired that at some stage the collection had been given to an Englishman, a friend of the family. With great difficulty, I eventually discovered that the Englishman had settled in South Africa, and after remaining in his family for a couple of generations, the collection had been bequeathed to the Beaufort West Museum. I went there only to find that it had been lent out to this museum for a temporary display." The children were impressed. It was quite a tale. "Why are you so interested in him?" Jane asked rather rudely, embarrassing Sam and Peter. They could tell she did not like the professor. He looked at her with an expression which was hard to read and replied slowly, "Well, I'm an expert in hieroglyphs, and I found many references to King Temenhut during my research in a number of different places and times. As I said, he was a great healer, unlike many of the other pharaohs or rulers who treated their people cruelly or unthinkingly. He healed rich and poor alike and was famous and popular. I want to find out more about him and the period he ruled. The early days of the Old Kingdom hold a particular interest for me." He smiled at the children. "So, tell me, I heard you saying something about a magic stone." There was an awkward silence, and the children exchanged silent glances of dismay and horror. No one spoke. "What stone?" the professor asked, this time quite fiercely. His pleasant, friendly expression had vanished, and he no longer looked like a kind old man. Later, the children thought of a million suitable replies, just as one does after having finished an unsuccessful argument, like, "Oh, we had to paint hieroglyphs on stones when we studied Egypt at school," or "Stone? We didn't say stone, we said bone," or "My uncle does stone carving and they look like the one Horus is holding." But besides the unexpectedness of the question, they were also hampered by the fact they could not remember exactly what they had said about the stone. At this critical moment, as the children were sitting silent and frozen in their chairs, desperately racking their brains for a suitable answer, and Professor Gamal had risen slightly out of his chair, as if to go up to them, Auntie Sue breezed in. Hello, sorry I took so long. Oh, good, you've all got something to drink. Have you paid?" "Not yet," Sam said, standing up hastily, and giving the others a meaningful glance which said, "Let's get out of here." They all got up and pushed their chairs in, and Auntie Sue went to pay. Professor Gamal stood up and said pleasantly, "If you ever have any more questions about Temenhut or ancient Egypt, please do contact me. Here's my card. My email and contact numbers are on there." Auntie Sue, paying at the counter, heard him and turned around surprised. He smiled at her and said in a kindly way, "Professor Gamal at your service. I was just telling these children about ancient Egypt. They seem very interested." "Thanks," Peter said, taking his card, and they all hurried towards the door, leaving Auntie Sue to follow, rather bemused at their hasty exit. Jane glanced back as she left the cafe and saw the professor sitting in his chair, staring after them. His eyes looked cold and hard, and she felt the hair on her arms prickle. She hurried after the others. "So," her mother said happily, "to the library and then home." The library was at the other end of town, and the children were glad to get into the car and put some distance between them and the nosy professor. "We must be more careful about mentioning the stone," Sam said quietly to Peter as Maylie and Jane chatted to Auntie Sue. "We must make a pact to never, ever mention it if there's a grown-up within 100 meters. Peter nodded in agreement. "Yes, I can't believe he heard us and asked about it." They were quite a while in the library, as Peter and Sam spent ages looking for books on Egypt and the pharaohs. Jane didn't have a card, not being local, so she helped Maylie pick out some picture books. As they drove out of town on their way back to the farm, they drove past the museum. They all glanced at it as they passed, but there was no sign of the professor. Maylie had chosen a book about a camel called Dan, and, as she could not read yet, and the older children wanted to make sure she didn't say anything inappropriate in front of Auntie Sue, Jane read aloud as they jolted along. Dan the camel lived in a dry old land. He lived in the Sahara Desert, a place filled with sand. But Dan dreamed of travelling to another place where no wild winds blew dust in his face. His biggest ambition, his dearest wish, was a day by the ocean, a swim with some fish, to sit on a towel and eat an ice cream and look out on more water than he'd ever seen. Please join us next week for Chapter 6, Maylie Makes a Wish. Please show your support for this podcast by subscribing, liking, and telling your friends. See you next week.